Hi, this is Matt McCormick. I'm in the Department of Philosophy at California State University, Sacramento. This is my first lecture for my Philosophy of Mind class on an article by Stanislaus Dehaene and Lionel Naccache. The article is called Toward a Cognitive Neuroscience of Consciousness, Basic Evidence and a Workspace Framework. This is the first lecture. Okay, so Dehaene and Naccache have three empirical theses that they want to three theses they want to argue for, and they want to build this on an empirical case. So the first thing they want to argue for is that there's a considerable amount of cognitive processing that goes on below the so-called conscious level that you're not aware of. So we might call this, it's not entirely accurate, but we might call this sensation or perception. This is stimulus that is detected or processed and has a causal impact on the cognitive system. So sounds, for instance, will do this on your body, on your system, but radio waves will not register. And some of you have heard another lecture from me based on an article by Dehaene about artificial intelligence and whether or not machines can be conscious. And some of these distinctions from this article from about 20 years ago get used even in the more recent article about artificial intelligence. So some of this will be familiar to you. So first off, there's a lot that our cognitive systems process and registers that remains below the consciousness threshold. It does not move into becoming something that we're aware of, that we can report on, that we remember, that we can explain on details about, and so on. So there's a lot of different ways that consciousness gets used here, but the way consciousness, roughly speaking, is being used in Dehaene and Naccache here is it's a sort of mid-level representation that is robustly available to lots of different cognitive systems, memory, motor centers, language centers, attention boosting, and so on. And so it gets used different than in some other cases. So lots of it happens without conscious processing, and that the mechanism that we're familiar with from folk psychology, the mechanism that boosts some of our experience from this low-level processing up into become aware into consciousness is attention. So they're going to give some credence to the folk psychological notion of attention when somebody says, "Hey, pay attention. Focus here. Listen to what I'm saying. Stop looking at your text or whatever. Wherever else your consciousness might be directed." So they're going to argue that attention, they also call that C1, is a prerequisite for consciousness. Attention occurs when the stimulus in 1 is boosted, that is, in C0, is boosted to be available to additional cognitive resources and processes. And furthermore, they're going to argue or set out a theory of consciousness, and they're going to argue that it's required for some specific cognitive tasks, that you've got to have this thing, consciousness, in order to do certain kinds of cognitive tasks. And this is interesting and important because we've seen a couple of philosophers now, Frank Jackson, Chalmers, Nagel, and some others, arguing that it's not clear that consciousness, at least I'm thinking of the epiphenomenalists, like C.D. Broad, that the idea is that consciousness or the contents of consciousness themselves are kind of a byproduct that are unnecessary or not essential for the actual functions of brain processes. And Dehaene and Naccache are going to take a very strong view here that you have to have consciousness in order to perform certain kinds of specific cognitive tasks. And the ones that they have in mind are ones that require durable information maintenance, novel combination of operations, or the spontaneous generation of intentional behavior. And I'll talk in more detail about what all of those are. Okay, so what's going on here in the bigger picture? Well, at any given time, there's lots of modular and sometimes not modular cerebral networks, some small, low-level cognitive processing neural nets that are active, and they're operating in parallel with each other, and they process information in an unconscious manner. That's going on all over the brain, through most of your waking hours. And a particular pattern of information will become conscious or become central or get sort of move into some level of awareness for you if the neural population that represents that content is mobilized by a top-down attentional amplification into brain scale state of coherent activity that involves many neurons distributed throughout the brain. So the idea here is that they're trying to connect up what we experience at the phenomenal subjective level of consciousness with the neuroscientific findings about what neurons are doing. So this is an effort to kind of synthesize what it is to be conscious with the neuroscientific theory about what's happening at the neural level. So the idea at the neural level then for this global workspace theory is that lots of discrimination. So by discrimination, we mean you've got some neurons that are vertical edge detectors, and you've got neurons that are horizontal edge detectors, and you've got other neurons that are dedicated to picking up colors, and all sorts of other things in your sensory field, just to keep the example simple. And those neurons, some of them by and large have a dedicated task. That's all they do. They just look for vertical edges. And when they see a vertical edge, they fire a lot. They get very excited when there's information coming through the visual pipeline that suggests that there's a vertical edge in the environment. So that neuron or that cluster of neurons, their job is to start firing. That's all they do when they see those vertical edges. And then whether or not that firing pattern gets picked up or noticed or amplified or broadcast to other parts of the brain depends on attention. So the idea is you've got this little cluster of neurons that are slaving away doing their work at this low-level unconscious stage, and there may be things happen further up the hierarchy, further up the up the layers that require that their work gets noticed, their work gets picked up by other neural groups or other modules or other portions of the brain, because the vertical edge that they detected happens to also be the edge of a stair when someone was walking up some stairs. So you paid enough attention perhaps to focus on it long enough to look at the edge, lift your foot, move your body, and step up onto the next step. So that neuron's work of the vertical edge detection got broadcast or amplified and boosted up to these other systems so that it could be incorporated into this other concerted action or planning or making decisions at these higher levels. Now, walking upstairs is very simple, but imagine the task is really much more complicated. Suppose you want to build some shelves. Okay, so I want to build some shelves, and I want to end up with the shelves having vertical edges that are horizontal to the floor, and maybe I want the shelves to be, 84 inches off the floor. Okay, so there's a great deal of cognitive processing that's going to go into the planning, the conceiving, the imagining, the picturing, the remembering, the talking about, the moving, the motor activity, all of this work that's going to now incorporate or amplify or make use of this little cluster of neurons work where they notice some vertical edges. That's what we mean by moving from this low level to this higher level representation. Okay, so some other major points about here, what's going on. What they mean by a global workspace is that they think they've got good neuroscientific evidence for this. They think there's some long distance connectivity of some workspace neurons. And what these do is that they traverse large regions of the brain. They go from visual centers to speech centers to motor centers to auditory centers. And as those neurons, when they get activated, they're the mechanism whereby this information gets broadcast or gets distributed to these other regions of the brain. So when they become available for a variety of these processes, so that you can do things like perceptual categorization, long-term memorization, evaluation, intentional action like building bookshelves or whatever. So we're asking the question, what is going on when I'm subjectively aware of something in my mind? And their answer is, and this is complicated, it's going to take some work to unpack it, but the answer is, this global availability of information through the workspace is what we subjectively experience as a conscious state. So when I've got this idea in my mind, when I'm remembering what my car looks like, So I'm conscious of an idea. That's what it's like on the phenomenal or subjective side. And they're going to argue that what that means is that there is a neural discrimination pattern that has become globally available to this thing, this global workspace that they're describing in their theory. So that when that happens, it becomes conscious. So there you have it. We've had a variety of philosophers arguing even that you can't have a theory of consciousness, and it's always embarrassing to say those sorts of things, or very risky to say those sorts of things, because no sooner do you say them than somebody goes to work on proving the very thing you said couldn't be done. So we've had some philosophers over the centuries arguing that consciousness can't possibly be explained, and here's an article giving us a theory of consciousness that explains it. Okay, now whether or not it's to be accepted and whether or not it ultimately survives the test of peer review and sort of broad-based disciplinary peer review acceptance, that's a new question. But it turns out this global workspace theory has been very influential. It's been very popular, and it's gotten a lot of attention in the 20 or 30 years since it's been postulated. That's one of the reasons that philosophers, among others, have been talking about it. Okay, so one of the things they want to answer, one of the questions they want to answer is, why are only some sorts of brain activities available to consciousness? They think, and this seems like a good idea to me, a complete theory of consciousness should explain why some cognitive and cerebral representations can be permanently or temporarily inaccessible to consciousness. What is the range of possible conscious contents? How they map onto specific cerebral circuits, and whether a generic neuronal mechanism underlies all of them. So those are some of the questions they think need to be answered. They want to know, for instance, why some of the work in your cognitive system never moves into consciousness and never becomes something that you're directly aware of. Like the regulation of your heartbeat, for instance, or your respiration. Those are all completely unconscious processes that are monitored and maintained by your cognitive system, but you've got no subjective or conscious access to them whatsoever. So they want to know why is some of the work of the brain available to consciousness and some of it's not. So we'll see some really interesting answers to those questions. We confront the workspace model, which is their model, with those issues and identify novel experimental predictions. Neurophysiological, anatomical, and brain imaging data strongly argue for a major role of prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, and the areas that connect them in creating the postulated brain scale workspace. So we're not going to dive into the actual detailed neuroscience of whether or not that's right. There's some controversy in the literature about a few details here. But what I think is useful for our purposes is seeing that we've actually got a working theory here that's trying to build a story about how consciousness at the subjective level unfolds from the objective, unfolds from the neurological level, and a plan for how to test it scientifically. Okay, so let's consider some of their findings that they think they've got to deal with. I've already mentioned, and we've talked about this a good deal in class already, that cognitive processing, a great deal of it happens without any sort of conscious awareness. One example that gets used a lot is this phenomena called Blindsight. And there's a few of these patients. They're really actually quite rare. A Blindsight patient is someone who is reports being blind at the conscious level. So were you to take a subject like this guy, I think they called him DB, if you ask him, you ask him, what is your phenomenal experience like? He'll say, I can't see anything. I'm not able to see. I'm blind. But if you give him tasks to do, like here, they're actually having him walk down a hall that's full of objects resting on the floor. If you give him a task, hold up your hand with some fingers and ask him to count, he'll say, well, I can't count those, or I can't get down the hall because I can't see, or I can't count your fingers. You say, well, go ahead and guess. And he'll actually do much better than random chance at guessing the answers to visual task questions. Or, as you can see, this guy can manage to navigate his way down the hall. And the way these sorts of examples get used in these contexts is to say, look, there's some neurological processing going on here so that at the very low level, DB can see in some sort of modified sense of see. That is, at some low level, there's neurological mechanisms here that are discriminating those objects in the hall, and they're feeding information to his motor center so he's able to make turns right and left and navigate around those objects. But he can't access at the sort of conscious level, at this subjective awareness level, he can't tell you that that's a trash can or that's a tripod or that there's something on the right or something on the left. So this happens in some of these strange brain damage cases, and Dehaene and Naccache's idea is that, and the way this is getting treated in the literature these days, is that this is a way to parse out or separate the different layers at which conscious processing is happening. Okay, so lots of it happens without our conscious awareness. And examples like Blindsight or these other cases, and you might look these up, there's some of them are just fascinating. Visual agnosia, prosopagnosia, achromatopoeia, callosal disconnection, aphasia, alexia, amnesia, and hemi-neglect, and a whole host of other cases. And we'll consider some more of those later in the semester. Here's another one that I've used. I use this in another lecture for our class. This is not somebody who's got a pathology. This is for an ordinary case. And I cited this study in a discussion of one of Dehaene's other articles. And so you may recall what's going on here. So what's happening here is from left to right. The subjects in this study are being shown first a noisy screen, a mask that has no real clear shape or can't really easily be identified. That's the column of pictures on the far left. And then the second, and they get exposed to that image for 500 milliseconds. That's long enough for them to register and see it and report on it. And then for 50 milliseconds, they get a flash of either a picture of Tom Cruise turned a little bit sideways, or Tom Cruise facing forward, or this other actor, I forget his name, he's Irish. And you get flashed that picture for 50 milliseconds, which is not enough time for you to be able to report or talk about what you saw. Then there's another 33 millisecond noisy mask. And then you're shown the picture of Tom Cruise for a half a second, so a good substantial bit of time, and you're asked to identify the picture of what you're seeing. And what happens is the second column amounts to what we call a prime. It's a very quick, low-level processing sensory representation that registers on the cognitive system. And the reason we know that it registers on the cognitive system is that people who are primed with that same picture of Tom Cruise, where my two red arrows go, they will actually answer the fastest on the identification case. So when you ask them to say at the end of this process, what's the picture you've seen, they have the fastest reaction time. But if you you flash them a prime of a different Tom Cruise or a different actor, it slows down their reaction time. So that's why we know, that's why we think that some conscious or some processing, some cognitive processing goes on at a so-called unconscious level. It's not something that you can, and the notion between conscious or unconscious here is being separated by Dehaene and Naccache as the difference between being able to remember, being able to report, being able to invoke motor centers or language centers or talk about it. So if you can do all of those things, then it's at the conscious level. If you can't, but we know that it registers, then it's an unconscious or C0 kind of stimulus. Okay, so the next stage. They next maintain not only that lots of cognitive processing is unconscious, but that attention is the process whereby, or it's a prerequisite for an information pattern or information discrimination moving into consciousness. So they're answering this question. Do all stimuli with sufficient intensity and duration automatically gain access to consciousness? And the answer is no. And here's partly what they're thinking about, partly what they're working on, is that is it that when you get a certain number of neurons or a stimulus of a certain level of intensity, does that just make it conscious? Well, it can happen that attention is a kind of selective, directable process. So in humans especially, if you give humans a task, they'll get this thing that's called inattentional blindness. So famously, in the study that I've pictured here on the right, they give subjects a task of counting the number of times that people in the white t-shirts pass the basketball. And then while the subjects are watching this video of people passing the basketball back and forth, and it's a very chaotic, noisy scene, the researchers have somebody in a black gorilla suit walk through the middle of the room and wave his arms and then walk off camera. It turns out that if people are concentrating and they're focusing their attention on the task that's involved, counting the number of basketball passes, they won't see the invisible gorilla. That is, you've got somebody in a gorilla suit in the middle of the room, jumping up and down, waving his arms, and people are looking right at the screen and they don't see him. Why? Because this top-down direction of attention is excluding all of the noisy, extraneous, unimportant information because it's focused on counting the number of basketball passes. So that's helping, that kind of research is helping them and helping theorists here get clearer on, well, what is this thing we call attention? Well, one of the things it does is it's inhibitory. It excludes, or it presses out, it pushes out lots of information so that it can focus on the information it's focused on. So conditions of stimulation then by themselves do not determine whether a given stimulus is or is not perceived consciously. It's not just a matter of how is somebody stimulated. Attention's selective and partially guided by the subject. Sometimes if you're concentrating on a task, you'll stay focused and shut everything else out. So there's lots of research here. Some of it's really incredibly interesting, but the invisible gorilla case is one of the most famous cases. Gives subjects a demanding visual discrimination task, and they'll fail to notice other visual stimuli. Okay, so that's part of their argument that attention's needed, and attention's a real thing. Because notice we've had this discussion all semester about, people like Paul Churchland and Dennett and some of his moods of whether to be eliminative materialists. That is, should we take seriously the folk psychological terms that we all use to describe minds? When we talk about beliefs, we talk about attention, we talk about willpower, we talk about consciousness and unconsciousness and so on. So we've got all of these folk psychological terms that we use in our everyday language whenever we're, just talking about our lives or talking about what we're going through. And the question here empirically for the scientists is, well, is there a thing that corresponds to that? It turns out there's no demons that correspond to medieval healers who were trying to deal with bubonic plague. They had to revamp and recount and take issue or take stock into what was real in the world, and they end up giving up on the demon theory. And so here's a way of Dehaene and Naccache acknowledging that they're not going to reject attention, they're not going to reject the notions of consciousness as non-existent demons. Those are actual things, and here's some empirical evidence that lets us triangulate on and figure out what they are. Okay, so attention is a process with limits, and it's a gateway into other levels of cognition. So it's a sort of bottleneck that boosts some of those low-level discriminations out into this larger levels of consciousness. Next, consciousness is required for specific kinds of mental operations. And this is going to get into some more important philosophical points for our purposes. Lots of processing we've seen is unconscious. Attention, furthermore, is selective about what stimuli get more resources or more processing. What would be the computational benefits or the cognitive benefits associated with having something be in consciousness, having an object be there to dedicate or think about or work on it more in the global workspace? They argue that there are three classes of computation that require consciousness. We need durable and explicit information maintenance, they say. We need to deal with novel combinations of operations, and we need to deal with intentional behavior. Okay, that all sounds really technical, but actually when you unpack all of this, it's really quite fascinating. So let's talk about them in each in turn. So look, if you've got a cognitive agent who's navigating through the world with a neural system, and they're being confronted by or having these various stimuli bombard their sensory periphery, if it doesn't make it, imagine a sensation that comes and then goes. So I'm in the middle of making this video, and there was a guy who just went gunning his car down the street and burning the wheels off and making a big screech with the tires, messing up my video quality. Okay, so that noise came into consciousness and went out, or came into my neural system and went out. And if I hadn't sort of registered it at some level, I wouldn't be talking about it now. I wouldn't be able to remember it because it's gone. That happened like 5-10 minutes ago. The noise happened and then it's disappeared. And very often what a complicated or sophisticated cognitive system needs to do, ones like ours, right, one like lots of primates, is that I need to be able to keep the idea in mind for a while, to talk about it, to think about it, to give it some durability, because the sensations, they come and go, they disappear. I've also got a flock of turkeys on my street that come up and down every few days, and they're picking in the grass for bugs. And I was thinking about this lecture and thinking about the turkeys. They've got tiny little turkey brains, not very, I don't know where they'd sort of fit or register on Dehaene and Naccache's scale, but there's not a lot of sort of durable long-term planning or reflection or high-level consciousness going on there, I suspect. I suspect that there's a lot of very low-level mechanisms that are in place for walking, for picking through the grass to find bugs, for dealing with when you're hungry, just very simple kind of zombie units, the way Dehaene and Naccache would describe it. But they're not doing this thing of talking about something or being able to remember it. And we need to be able to maintain representations in an active state for a durable period of time in the absence of the stimulation. And that seems to be required for consciousness. In order for me to do this thing I'm doing, which is talking about it, which is theorizing about it, and theorizing about us, or for us to plan or do all the fancy cognitive things we do, it's got to stay in there longer. It's got to be durable. So we need consciousness in order to remember things, even if only for a few seconds. So by encoding the firing patterns of active populations of neurons and sustaining it there, that information remains available to systems even when the stimulus is not. So imagine like a lower level of consciousness, somebody who's got all that higher level stuff suppressed or doesn't function or whatever. Just imagine someone for whom the feels just come in and go out all day at the sensory periphery without anything else. And that's what a mind without consciousness at this kind of level is like. Very dark in there. Okay. And just on this note, I'm going to do a brief diversion onto this paper by Muggan and McIver. The paper is called The Shift to Life on Land, Selected for Planning. And I just wanted to point out this article. There's a whole field of research here. And what these guys argue is that they say, here we present evidence that a reason for the absence of planning in fish and many other aquatic animals is that in a key driver of natural selection, predator-prey interactions, there is no benefit to planning above habitat-based action selection. So here's what they mean. In our evolutionary history, there was a stage from which life went from being in the ocean or in the water to moving up onto land. And they argue that your sensory periphery and your cognitive tasks you have to deal with when you're in the water are fairly limited. You can't see very far. You don't need to. You can't see something coming. If you're deep in the dark, murky water, you can't see something coming a half mile off. So the only kinds of neural mechanisms you need to deal with events are for objects that move right into your immediate sensory periphery. So if you see it right in front of you, if it happens right next to you, then you need to react immediately. And if you go to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, you'll see that giant tank full of sardines that are all moving in concert with each other. And one of them will shift course a little bit, and they'll all immediately react, and the direction will shift, ripple through the whole school of fish. So fish brains don't need to look out to the visual horizon very far. They can't look out to the visual horizon very far to deal with obstacles or deal with predators or deal with problems. They have to deal with stuff that's just right there immediately in front of them. And then that kind of processing requires near instantaneous reaction. So there's no planning, there's no discussing, there's no reasoning, there's no long-term sustained representation of what's going on there. There's just action, there's just sensation and reaction. So what these guys argue, and they're actually working on, a related field. We're talking about building out a theory about how does consciousness work, or what is it for, what did it develop for. Well, this is one article. There's a number of other people working in this field who they argue that when fish moved out onto land, the horizon for being able to see, the visual distances we could see stretched out, but to hundreds of meters, or to half a mile, to a mile. So suddenly we could see much further. So now you can see you can see predators coming from a mile away, and you've got time to think about it and time to deal with it. So they argue that the movement out onto land changed the selection pressures and fostered or boosted this growth in brain capacity that ultimately culminated in mammals having the ability to engage in some pretty sophisticated advanced planning and representational or conscious capacity, thinking about their lives and thinking about their challenges and obstacles, trying to get food, trying to avoid being eaten, and the like. So that article is really interesting. I first encountered this with a podcast with Sean Carroll, and he talks to MacGyver about this argument and the research, and it's just fascinating. So a side note, but it's related to the general scientific empirical inquiries trying to understand how does consciousness work. Okay, so now back to Dehaene and Naccache. Similar to the point about sort of fish experience from the previous article, they argue that without attention, or without this boosting into consciousness, stimuli have exponential decay. So the interaction or the stimulation of the environment has on your system that creates this neural reaction in the short term is going to rapidly decay unless you can move it into these higher, more substantial levels of cognitive processing and get some of these other neurological mechanisms engaged. So some questions for you. Was the person in front of you at Starbucks today when you ordered coffee a man or a woman? What was the song on the radio when you drove your car yesterday? Or did you have a green light or a red light when you got close to your house when you were coming home today? Did you enter Home Depot through a single or a double door? Did you go in through the left one or the right one when you were there the last time? Or sometimes in class I'll ask, what color are my eyes and what color is my shirt? Now you can look at it right now and focus on the color of my shirt, but notice those other questions all ask for information that were at the CO level of processing. Those were things that you sensed. Obviously, if you ordered coffee at Starbucks, you noticed the person in front of you, or if you walked into the door at Home Depot, you registered at some cognitive level that it was a single or double door, and you chose to go through the left or the right one. But that information, if it's not important, if it doesn't serve any larger cognitive purpose, that just almost immediately disappears in your system and doesn't get worked on or dealt with at the neural level any more than just this sort of immediate moments during sensation. So their argument then is that that you need attention and you need this boosting of cognitive resources in order to do more work than that, right? That will only get you so far. Okay, so consciousness, they argue, is also required for novel combinations of operations. So you can't make everything sort of automatic. Lots of the things we learn to do, they quickly get sublimated down to the automatic level and you stop thinking about them consciously. But whenever you've got to do a novel task or an unusual task, when you're trying to work on your tennis backswing, or if you're trying to learn how to have better form when you're deadlifting, you focus and invest a bunch more cognitive energy into thinking about, how you're moving your arm or what you're doing. And you need consciousness for that to improve on performance or to solve certain kinds of problems or to deal with novelty. So one of the examples they give here, and this is actually about inhibition, is this test called the Stroop test, or the Stroop effect. And what happens is that for all of those words on the right, in the cases where, let's see, are all of them the font is in a color that's different than what the word says. So for all of those words, if I had given you the word yellow, and put it in yellow font, your a bit like my Tom Cruise example, your ability to read that word would be sped up. But in the case where you've got this, the word yellow in green font, or you've got the word black in yellow font, that's trouble. That's your neural system is struggling with the conflict, because you've got one set of neurons that are registering one fact about that visual image, the fact that it's yellow, and another set of neurons is telling you, but no, that's the word black. So there's a bit of conflict there, and it's a novel task, or it's an unusual task. It's something new. It's something different, and in principle, it's not different than working on your technique at your tennis backhand as well. It's that you're taking something that would be sublimated and just be automatic and easy without thinking about it, and you're making it, you're inhibiting some of those low-level processors, and you're focusing on some other aspect of it. So in order to read that word yellow, I've got to inhibit, my attention is inhibiting the neural the subsystems that are registering the fact that it's green font. So that kind of consciousness is needed to plan a novel strategy, to evaluate it, to control its execution, to correct errors, and any kind of metacognitive operation where I'm doing something and then I'm evaluating my performance at it. I'm thinking about, well, am I good at math? I just did a math problem. Now, can I trust my output? Or am I good at this? Yeah, I think I'm good at this. Am I good at judging, who's trustworthy? Yeah, I think so. And I use my memory or whatever. Any kind of process like that requires consciousness. So that's what they mean by novel combinations of operations in the original thesis. Okay, finally, consciousness is needed for the spontaneous generation of intentional behavior. Okay, so let me see if I can explain what that means. Again, when we sublimate or put these, when this cognitive work is kept down at the low parallel level, those processes can only get us so far. I mean, imagine, at the turkey level, or it's some lower level, the sorts of cognitive problems you can solve. There's a ceiling on how much you can get or how far you can get from that. And they maintain that there's a wide range of problem solving, planning, behavioral solutions to significant environmental challenges that cannot be addressed by those narrow, isolated modules. So they're actually looking and seeing, well, look, you've got this neural mechanism here that's working on this discrimination, and it provides this answer to the question about, what color is the font. And you've got this other neural system that is assisting in the reading of the word. And you've got to make some decisions at the higher level to once you can get up to the conscious level, now we can make plans, we can do deal with environmental challenges that just those simple so-called zombie units can't deal with. But if the contents of consciousness are reportable, so see, the problem is that we've got a kind of division of labor, that there are millions and millions of isolated small networks of neurons that do their work. And they all do their work at the low level. And what we're wanting, or what the goal here for intentional behavior is, that if we could have the contents of consciousness in one of those regions or one of those neural subsystems be available to one of the other systems, then you could report it, right? If you could have the contents of consciousness, if they're reportable with language, if they're available for planning, if they're accessible to a wide range of capacities, if they're memorable, then we can solve lots of problems. That was my point about building bookshelves earlier, right? So you've got to have this, if I'm going to form an intention or a plan to build some bookshelves, I've got to be able to invoke the low-level divided labor of a lot of different specific task-specific systems. I need to get all of them working in concert to solve a much more complicated problem. Dehaene and Naccache actually mentioned the discussion here about the Blindsight patients, and they refer to this philosophical zombie discussion like we've been having in our class. And they asked the question, well, then are Blindsight patients, do they amount to being the sort of philosophical zombie that David Chalmers was talking about? And their answer is no, they can't be, and that such a thing isn't possible. So this is, where would this fit? This is going to fit in either type A or type B materialism on the Chalmers account. These guys are going to maintain that Blindsight patients, there's something they can't do. Now, Blindsight patients can successfully navigate down the hall and avoid the obstacles, but Dehaene and Naccache say they never spontaneously initiate any visually guided behavior in their impaired field. So one thing that DB couldn't possibly do in that video is on his own decide to pick up that trash can and then use it to go clear some trash off the desk or whatever. Pick whatever sort of intentional behavior. The higher level systems that do this sort of overarching connecting between these different modules are not able to function right in a Blindsight case. And so philosophical zombies, if you were to actually create them in the natural world, they'd lose all of this cognitive problem-solving capacity. So actually, Dehaene and Naccache are arguing that having these internal, phenomenal, subjective states are necessary, and they are part of the neural processing, because that's a sort of mid-level report that having qualitative states that I can report on, that I can examine, that I can use words to describe, that I can recall, that are conscious states, that has given me something at this mid-level that I can work with. One of the examples that Christoph Cook uses is that when Ronald Reagan was president, he famously required of all of his cabinet members, Housing and Urban Development and the EPA and so on, he would give each one of them a little bit of time each day, and they had to come in and give him a full report of what was going on in their vast governmental regulatory departments, but they had to confine it to a single page. They couldn't. Their report couldn't last any longer, or have any more information than could be contained on a single page. So you might think about conscious or qualitative states as a kind of mid-level, manageable report like that. That it gives me a thing to attach my attention and my cognitive processes to, and to manipulate inside the mind to go to work on it, to plan on, and to anticipate and deal and solve problems and the like. So Dehaene and Naccache are arguing that that conscious qualitative states at the subjective level are needed in order for us to form actions or form plans to intentionally behave, to form a goal in our minds, and then form a plan, and then act on it and act accordingly. Okay, so that's all I'm going to do on part one, my first lecture on Dehaene and Naccache. So what we've seen is that they've argued that lots of cognitive processing happens at the C0 level without consciousness. They've argued that attention, which can both be captured bottom up or directed top down, it boosts computational resources and capacities by making information from the lower level available to other systems. And then consciousness, what it does is it creates a sustained representation for cognitive tasks that operate on a representation after it's no longer available in sensation. So once the sound is gone, the noise is gone, the color, the shape, the immediate experience is gone, what consciousness does is it creates and sustains this durable information module, this idea in the mind that then can be remembered, that can be used or employed in novel combinations of operations, that I can use for intentional behavior, that I then can use to imagine, to plan, to decide, to problem solve, and so on.